During my sophomore year in high school, I was looking around my engineering class when I noticed something. I was the only girl in the room.
There are far too many girls who at this very moment are questioning whether they belong in STEM.
It was demoralizing to see that I was the only girl in my higher level STEM classes.
That's when it hit me, how few women are in STEM.
I noticed it was the boys who were encouraged to do the fun things like light the Bunsen burners or program the robots.
It was hard to picture myself in a field where I saw no one that looked like me.
It wasn't a place where girls like me felt welcomed or encouraged.
When I found out that I got into a high school STEM internship, I had never felt so proud.
I soon met my first ever female engineer.
And they've opened my eyes to what the future of STEM could look like for women like me.
I got the chance to learn from female engineers excelling in their fields.
I remember a woman in leadership telling us about all the incredible things she'd accomplished, and she did it all in a bright pink suit.
It's so important that girls grow up seeing people like them succeeding in STEM, or else many of them might just give up on their dreams.
I urge you to create an inclusive high school STEM internship program so girls can grow up in a world where they see themselves represented.
Not every girl gets the chance to be inspired by female role models. The only question I have for you is why not?
At Horizon, we have achieved pay equity, which means that men, women, and all ethnicity groups receive equal pay for equal work. This puts us amongst the 1% of companies globally that have achieved this target. Our goal is to provide equal access to opportunities, development, and advancement, and to make sure that performance drives pay, not gender, not ethnicity, not background. Please join us in making pay equity a standard and not an exception. Together, we can create a more equitable workplace for all.
Good morning. My name is Alicia Hardasani Gupta, and I am a gender reporter at the New York Times. Thank you for joining us from across the globe for an important and timely conversation on a gender-inclusive global economic recovery. Thank you to the Chicago Council for having me, and the Council's members and partners for joining us via YouTube for today's program. This event is part of the Women, Equity, and Global Development Forum. As a reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals here are their own, and they do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. The impact of the last year and a half can all be summed up with 3 statistics. The first is $800 billion. That's how much the pandemic, job losses, and the increased caregiving demands have cost women globally. The second figure is 2024. That's when experts think female employment in the US may reach pre-pandemic levels. Men might reach that milestone sooner. And the third statistic is 25%. That's the share of women in the US who are now considering stepping back or stepping out of the workforce. The story here is that COVID-19 has dramatically impacted women around the world, emphasizing the disproportionate burdens they carry within family structures, society, the economy, and beyond. Women are burned out, many have been pushed into poverty, and many others have simply given up. As nations now focus on strategies to promote economic recovery, an intersectional approach that puts women and girls at the center is critical for rebuilding stronger and withstanding future crises. It is my great honor to kick off this forum by interviewing someone who knows a little something about Building Back Better, Jennifer Klein. Jennifer is the co-chair and executive director of the White House Gender Policy Council. Before this role, she was deputy and senior advisor in the Office of Global Women's Issues within the State Department. She has also worked at the White House as senior domestic policy advisor for First Lady Hillary Clinton and a special assistant to the president on the Domestic Policy Council. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. Great to see you, Alicia.
We first spoke when you were preparing to start your new role in the White House. If I remember correctly, you didn't even have security clearance to get into the White House back then. So how has the transition been for you personally, taking on this new role?
It's been great. I think as we talked about at the time, I was really excited to get started, and many of my hopes about what this council would be have really come to pass. one of the things I always mention when thinking about and talking about the council is that we renamed. There had been previous efforts in previous administrations focused on women and girls, and we renamed the council, and the words of the council really speak to what it is. And again, as we talked about at the time, and I reflect on now, 6 or more months in, that name change really reflects the work that we're doing. So, we're a gender policy council, gender. So while we are laser focused on women and girls for many of the reasons that you already alluded to, and so many more, we want to ensure that we are fighting for gender equity and gender equality for women and girls, but also more broadly and really understanding gender in a broader sense. We can talk more about that. And the second is policy. We are a policy council. While we do a tremendous amount of outreach to all sorts of stakeholders outside the government, we're about getting policies passed and done in this administration. And we really cross both global and domestic because, as you know, and I know the people participating today know better than anyone, these issues are both global and domestic. They transcend borders. And that's why it was really important to me as I took over the leadership of this council to really have it be focused both on national security and foreign policy as well as on domestic policy.
Right. So as you mentioned, the name change is a major difference between your council and previous similar councils in the White House. And I've done a ton of reporting on this, as you know, and, I've found that your council is the most powerful body of its kind to date compared to previous similar councils. So could you walk us through how that is? How is it structured differently this time? And what kind of authority does that give you?
It's great to hear. We really are very much ingrained in, as I said, the policy making work at the White House. And I think it's actually really important to also think about where we came from. And I got all sorts of advice from the people who had run previous councils, including most recently, obviously, Valerie Jarrett and Tina Chen, who had run the White House Council on Women and Girls in the Obama administration. And really, as I said, the notion that we're a policy council alongside and working in really close coordination with the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, and our other new council here at the White House, the National Climate Council, is really important. That stakeholder engagement, really learn that lesson from Tina and Valerie and from the previous efforts in, as I said, both Republican and Democratic administrations. As you noted in your introduction, I worked in the White House and the Clinton administration for the First Lady, but also on the Domestic Policy Council. And so I talked a lot to her and to Milan Revere, who was her chief of staff at the White House, about the efforts in the Clinton White House and sort of what we would all do the same and differently. And I think the combination of working with external stakeholders, as I said, whether that's other governments, foreign governments, multilateral organizations, state, local, and tribal governments, advocacy groups, women's leaders, and other members of civil society, and the private sector, really all of that is part and parcel of the work that we are doing.
How does the council actually work, when it comes to crafting policies? Do legislative proposals go through you for a stamp of approval, or are you going to different agencies and saying, here's what you should consider X, Y, Z?
We are actually about to launch the first ever national gender strategy. We're also going to be among the first countries to have national gender strategies, although I am always clear to say that the U.S. has a lot to learn on gender equity and gender equality from many countries around the world in terms of our policies, our practices, and even some of our norms. But I am really proud to say that we are about to launch this strategy. And, it has a couple of guiding principles, but one of them is something that you just alluded to, which is that it is really a whole of government approach. So what our council is and means to be is a forum for the work of the entire administration, because, by the way, we are small and we are mighty, but we are never going to actually bring gender equity or gender equality to the United States if we don't work with all of the agencies. So formally, every cabinet secretary and agency head is a member of the council. Each of them appointed a senior designee with whom we work really closely, and each of whom in the implementation of the strategy is asked to really prioritize their own agency's work. And we will be working with them in the years and months ahead to implement the strategy in ways that really are effective and make the most change.
So let's come to now to the biggest crisis that you as a gender policy counselor are facing, which is COVID. As I mentioned earlier, the last year and a half has pushed women out of the workforce in record numbers in what is known as the first female recession. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, women have lost nearly 3 million jobs to the crisis, and there are now 1.6 million fewer women in the labor force than there were in February 2020. And while the unemployment rate overall is starting to come down, it still remains high for Black and Hispanic women. Could you explain how the Buildback Better Plan prioritizes a gender-inclusive economic recovery?
Yes, and thank you so much for that question, because you are exactly right. I mean, it is a core focus, obviously, of this country, other countries around the world, and this White House and this administration in particular. And again, you talked about those really striking statistics early on. You know that strengthening women's economic security and labor force participation is essential to gender equity and gender equality. And this imperative is clearer than it has ever been before as we work toward an economic recovery and a recovery more generally to the pandemic. And, to use the president's words, which continue to resonate with me every single day, we need to build back better for everyone. COVID has fueled an economic crisis, a health crisis, and then on top of that, a caregiving crisis, each of which has had disproportionate effects on women and girls, especially women and girls of color. But these structural crises and inequities are not new. And the pandemic has exacerbated or magnified existing inequities. But women and girls in the U.S. and, by the way, around the world have long faced systemic discrimination that inhibited their full participation in the labor force, access to health care and education and security, as well as that of their families. In the U.S. alone, it took just 1 year to erase 30 years of women's labor force participation. As you mentioned, millions of women have lost their jobs, been forced to leave the workforce or cut back on their hours to take care of their families as a result of COVID-19. And as I'm sure this audience knows well, this trend was reflected globally. So while women make up only 39% of the global workforce, they account for well over half of the pandemic-related job losses. So as I said, this is not new. But the pandemic has really crystallized these problems. So as we work to ensure an equitable recovery, including through the president's infrastructure plan and the Build Back Better agenda, we're really at an inflection point. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to ensure that women and families and children are at the center of our economic growth strategy. This is about, ensuring that the economy works for everyone. And so to do that, we have to invest in the supports that help women and working families have access to good paying jobs, including by investing in our care.
So care economy, let's get to that. I would really love some specifics from you on what's in the plan, or what the president has proposed to put in that plan. I know it's all in flux and it's going through Congress, but this pandemic has really shone a light on how precarious the care economy was in the U.S., right? Childcare has always been unaffordable and inaccessible for so many parents. The burdens on the sandwich generation is just growing bigger and bigger. So what are the elements in the plan that you're hoping, Congress will pass?
Yeah, I mean, you said it so well. The pandemic has really amplified the unequal burden of care that has been shouldered for women and girls, again, in the United States and around the world. The thing that differentiates the United States from many other countries in the world, by the way, is that we don't have that infrastructure in place, which is what is making passing reconciliation, which includes both the infrastructure piece and the Build Back Better piece of the president's plan. It's ambitious, but I think what we have seen in the last year and a half plus is that it's necessary. It's essential if we want to see a full economic recovery. And so that's why, again, to your point, the president's plan includes a number of different things, but includes focus on childcare, elder care, home care, paid family and medical leave, all of the elements that from birth to the end of life are required to support the caregiving needs of families. And in the case of women, many of the women are the people who are bearing the disproportionate burden of that care. But it really is a continuum. And the other thing, and I'm always really mindful of pointing this out, is that we need to value our caregivers, right? We saw again in the pandemic that these are the essential workers who have historically been undervalued and underpaid. And so again, what the pandemic has made clearer than ever is that we need to ensure that those jobs, whether that's in childcare or in home care or other parts of the healthcare field, those are jobs that we value. Those are jobs that have adequate benefits, adequate wages, and dignity.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point because, I've found in my reporting, childcare workers are predominantly women of color, and many of them live in poverty themselves. They don't have any benefits, so they're sort of on food coupons and things like that. So being a childcare provider is one of the lowest paid occupations in this country. So I've noticed that senior administration officials have been reaching out to businesses to rally their support for the Build Back Better plan. So what role does the White House hope that the private sector will play here?
I think there's really two things. I think number one is businesses know that these care policies matter if they want to keep women in the workforce in particular, but if they want workers more generally, men, women, all workers, to be able to be their most productive selves, we need to support care policies. And, despite the sort of image that these are costly to businesses or that businesses don't actually support care policies, in fact, they do. And when you talk to businesses, especially small businesses, actually, who are at an economic disadvantage, getting workers and competing, they know that having the infrastructure in place so that people can take care of their families, meet their responsibilities to their families, and also show up at work ready to go, and also to address, the labor force shortages that we're all seeing over the past months. They know that these are policies that matter. And I think the second thing to keep in mind is that there are things that businesses can do today. And many of them are really, again, seeing the economic imperative. Many companies are stepping up to actually take action in their own workplaces way before we have legislation in place. And that's a combination of ensuring that workers have the supports they need within their own company, eliminating discrimination and bias and harassment within the workforce. There are policies, there are practices, and really there are norms in place in workplaces across the country and again around the world that really have been harmful in the past and can be addressed right now. And you're seeing so many companies who see both the need but also the benefit to them, quite frankly. Right.
So let's zoom out globally then. Earlier this year, the U.S. announced $40 billion in gender equality commitments at the UN Generation Equality Forum in Paris. You and I connected at that point because I know that this is something that you spearheaded, and it includes a global 5-year action plan to accelerate gender equality around the world. So could you give us some details about what those commitments entail?
Yeah. So, just to take a second about what Generation Equality was, it was the celebration of the 25th, except on the 26th actual anniversary of the Beijing Conference on Women. And it really responded to sort of the ambition that came out of that conference. Back in 1995, by the way, when I was working for Hillary Clinton, when she was First Lady, she led a delegation, the U.S. delegation, to the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. And she declared women's rights are human rights then. And just over 25 years later, our efforts to restore and strengthen American leadership on women's human rights globally are an extension of our commitment to advance human rights and gender equality here at home. So, we've made progress. I won't go through all of the details, but just to hit a few highlights. Globally, the gender gap in primary education has virtually closed. Global maternal mortality rates have plummeted, and more than 155 countries have passed laws on domestic violence, while 140 countries now have laws on sexual harassment in the workplace. But as we've been talking about, we know that these structural inequities and gender gaps persist, exacerbated by COVID, that restrict the opportunities and advancement of women and girls at home and abroad. And we do have significant work to do, which is why the U.S. made significant commitments in 3 areas at Generation Equality. So what we talked about was a couple of things. Gender-based violence, which is really a linchpin to creating an environment that enables progress pretty much on every other gender issue, of course, important in its own right to make sure that people are able to live safely and free from violence. But it also, because it is endemic in our workplaces and in our homes, in our communities, and public and politics, online and offline, by the way, it's important to address gender-based violence in all its forms, because it is the thing that enables people to participate fully. Health is another really basic need. People are unable to participate fully in their society, in their economy, without adequate access to health care, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. And all of those things are, of course, critical to gender equality more broadly. So that was the second area that the U.S. made commitments in. And then the third was economic security, very much sort of a global analog to what we are doing right here at home. And so we, just to take one example, sort of a large piece of our economic agenda that we announced at Generation Equality, we mobilized at least $12 billion over the next 5 years through the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, as part of what we call a 2X commitment to invest in businesses that advance gender equity in emerging markets. And the other thing that, more to come, but that the U.S. has done globally, but again with, a complete parallel to the work we're doing in the United States, is working on Buildback Better, which is a really global infrastructure investment that the President and other G7 countries announced in tandem. And that will also be an opportunity to ensure that, that we really weave gender equality throughout infrastructure investments around the world.
So, it's interesting you mentioned initially the progress that has been made since the Beijing conference, right? And one of the things that I found in my reporting is a kind of backlash on this progress on women's rights around the world. Everywhere those rights are in jeopardy or being rolled back. Afghanistan being just one example, right? Does that trend concern you? Have you found that? Are you concerned about that?
I am always concerned about backlash, and I do think it's really important to take notice, first of all, and to ensure that we are ready to respond. So yes, I hear you, and as we've been talking about, like what you have seen during COVID, again, it's not new, but it definitely has made a number of things worse. I mean, access to family planning, incursions on women's rights, an increase in gender-based violence, which people have referred to as a shadow pandemic. all of those are real, and all of those are very much worthy of international attention and the attention of the United States government. That said, I'm also optimistic. I feel like I would never use the word opportunity, but I feel like at this moment, we are at an inflection point. We do have an opportunity to actually face a major series of structural crises around the world by actually getting to the moment where we can make deep, long-term structural change. And I really think that's true here and around the world.
Right. Coming back to something else you alluded to, the United States actually lags really far behind other developed countries when it comes to gender equality. Like you said, there is no paid leave, there's no childcare support, there are extremely high maternal mortality rates. Female labor force participation has been stagnant since 1990. And as Texas showed us, reproductive rights are, sort of hang by a thread. Are you worried about America's standing on the world, on the global stage? Despite the fact that you're making these commitments, do you think there's faith in what America stands for?
I do. I mean, this is a nonpartisan forum, but I would be not giving the whole picture if I think that over the previous administration, I think we really put that standing in jeopardy. But I think that I hope that the rest of the world has seen from the Biden-Harris administration a commitment to gender equity and gender equality, and by the way, a commitment to the intersection between gender equity and equality and other forms of bias and discrimination, and a real seriousness with approaching those both in the United States and around the world. So I spent a lot of time over the last several years worrying about America's standing in the world, but I really hope through the appointment of this council, but so much beyond, but the existence of this council, so much related to the work we are doing really across this administration to center equity, to center human rights. I think there's too much work to do to stop and worry, but I'm not worried.
Okay. I guess that brings me to my audience question. I'm going to ask you something that came in from Rudy Altergott. Their question is, in our uncertain and scary world, what trends or signs are you seeing that make you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful is that, and this has really been my life's work, that we need to change private sector practices, policies, what actually happens every day when people go to work. We need to change government policies, but we also need to change norms. And one of the things that I think happened over the last several years is that opportunity for norm change, for attitude change, for sort of a historic amount of discrimination, bias, really low expectations has really changed. And so that's why, and the president says this, but I really think it's true. And to focus on these words, we are at an inflection point. We sort of can't look away from what we have all experienced and seen. And I think, the part that makes me hopeful is that you really do see the seeds of change. You really do see people thinking, we're done. We need to actually address some of these longstanding structural issues that for too long have persisted both here in the United States and around the world.
That is a very hopeful answer. Thank you. And that's a nice note to end on. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your time and for sharing such valuable insights with the audience here today.
Thank you, Alicia. Thanks all.
It is my great honor to introduce Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, this year's Women, Equity, and Global Development Forum Keynote Speaker, who will deliver a message on the importance of international cooperation for an inclusive economic recovery. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala is the first woman and the first African to serve as Director General of the World Trade Organization. She served twice as Nigeria's finance minister and briefly acted as foreign minister in 2006, the first woman to hold both positions. And before that, she has had a 25-year career at the World Bank as a development economist. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, thank you for your participation. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, 136 years. That's how long it would take to achieve gender parity globally at the current rate of convergence, according to the World Economic Forum. COVID-19 has set women back economically, politically, and socially. Before the pandemic, we were on track for parity in a mere 99.5 years. A famous estimate by McKinsey suggested we were foregoing as much as $28 trillion in potential annual economic output by allowing gender inequality to persist. So it's not enough for the recovery to get us back to where we were on gender inclusion in 2019. We have to do much better. This will take concrete policy action at the domestic and international levels. And frankly, it will take social and behavioral change within families and workplaces. I'm grateful to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for bringing this fantastic group together to look at what needs to be done. While I'm unable to join you today, I'm happy to share this message. The economic crisis provoked by COVID-19 has hit women harder than men, both in the paid workforce and the burden of unpaid care work within households. The International Labour Organization estimates that in 2020, 4.2% of women's employment worldwide, or about 54 million jobs, were lost to the crisis, compared to 3% for men. One reason for the difference is that women are overrepresented in sectors involving face-to-face interactions or physical proximity, such as tourism, agriculture, retail, garment and textile manufacturing, and domestic services. These sectors were among those hardest hit by the crisis, meaning greater health risks for the women who did continue working. Look at tourism, which has shed 62 million jobs amid travel bans, lockdowns, and plummeting demand. Women make up 54% of workers in the sector globally and suffered 53% of tourism job losses in the US and 45% in Latin America. Women-owned businesses typically have less capacity than their male counterparts to weather economic storms, as they tend to be smaller, often informal, and with less access to financial resources. Women workers also tend to be employed in lower-skilled, lower-paid part-time and informal jobs. But pandemic-related financial support for small businesses has often de facto left out women, since governments have frequently targeted them at formal firms with employees rather than at self-employed entrepreneurs running informal businesses. In fact, by UNDP's tracker of the gender implications of pandemic response policies, only 9% of all COVID-19 mitigation measures explicitly target women's economic security. International trade offers one potential avenue for building back economies that work better for women. Merchandise trade in particular has proven to be resilient and is back at record highs, thanks in part to restraint in the use of protectionism. Firms engaged in international trade tend to employ more women and pay them better than non-exporting firms. There are many examples of national policies and free trade agreements that include provisions favoring women, such as set-asides for women-owned businesses in government procurement, targeted schemes for access to information, finance and subsidies, investments in women's education and skills development, and protection against violence, measures to lower barriers facing small businesses and expand market access in sectors where women are disproportionately represented, also narrow the economic opportunity gap for women. A potential economic opportunity for women is in digital trade. The pandemic accentuated this opportunity. As lockdowns and travel bans took hold, many women made up their business losses by exploiting new market opportunities on the internet. Thus, e-commerce provided a lifeline for women-owned micro, small, and medium enterprises. At the WTO, an informal working group of 127 members has been working to understand, analyze, and lower the barriers facing women in international markets. I hope they'll be able to take another step forward in their work at our 12th Ministerial Conference, which starts in late November. For a lasting economic recovery, we need vaccine equity. But to build back better, more prosperous and more inclusive economies, we need gender equity. Thank you, and I wish you a successful meeting.
Thank you, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Hi, everyone. My name is Brooke Masters, and I'm Chief Business Commentator at the Financial Times. Welcome to the 2021 Women, Equity, and Global Development Forum and this exciting panel on gender-inclusive global economic recovery. Thanks for joining us via YouTube for today's On the Record program. Just as a reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by the individuals we host are their own. Today, we are discussing how to build a sustainable and inclusive post-pandemic economic recovery that puts women and girls at the very center. Our panel includes Latifa Lyles, who is Vice President for Advocacy and Survivors Initiatives at Time's Up. A former head of the Women's Bureau at the U.S. Department of Labor, she's been working on economic and equity issues for 15 years. Ai-jen Poo is Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and Director of Caring Across Generations. A trustee of the Ford Foundation, she is a nationally recognized expert on elder and family care and the future of work. And we have Sadia Zahidi, who is Managing Director of the New Economy and Society team at the World Economic Forum. She co-authors the forum's reports on the future of jobs, the global gender gap, and the human capital report. Recovery from last year's huge COVID-related job losses has been highly uneven, according to the International Labor Organization. While male employment has basically rebounded, women are still out of work, and there are still 13 million fewer working than in 2019. Why is this happening, and what can we do about it? Latifa, do you want to start us off?
Absolutely. So everybody's feeling the effects of the pandemic, the effects of quarantine, and the labor force shortages across the country. There's no question at all that women are bearing the brunt of so many of the pulls and the pressures right now. This is from caregiving for our loved ones. It's taking care of our parents. It's taking care of our kids. The uncertainty with school in the past year, people really just had extraordinarily hard choices. And despite the fact that, we have dual parent households in some cases, women are usually taking on most of that care in the home, and the supports that didn't exist before the pandemic are still not there, only being exacerbated. So we are seeing more women having to drop out altogether and seeing less opportunity to ramp back on.
Ai-jen, what do you think?
I agree with everything that Latifa just said. I think in the United States, we're at 1988 levels of women's labor force participation. And the data shows us that most of the women who are pushed out of the labor force were pushed out because of caregiving challenges as parents and caring for aging loved ones, caring for loved ones with disabilities. I also think that women are disproportionately concentrated in in-person service jobs. Many of the jobs where sectors were devastated in the shutdown, including care. I work with a population of domestic workers who work inside of other people's homes. And even though more people are vaccinated, being able to return into someone's home to do that work is something that actually is complicated with the Delta variant and other variants surging. And so we're still at a 25% unemployment rate for domestic workers. And I think that that's probably the case for many other sectors where you actually have to be in person and proximate to other people.
Sadia?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that what you said about this trend is true all around the world. So every year we measure through our Global Gender Gap report how long it's taking to get to gender parity. And 2 years ago, we were looking at 99 years, which is absolutely not acceptable anyway. But we just added another 35 years to that because of how much the rate of change slowed down or in many countries went backwards. So that's yet another generation or two that has to wait for parity unless we're able to reverse these trends. And I'd say certainly one aspect that is global is that the burden of caregiving responsibility, both childcare and elder care, falls on women. Some countries that have a good care infrastructure have fared relatively better. And in many other parts of the world, including in the United States, that hasn't been helpful to women returning to the workforce. The second is really very much what Aijen said about industries specifically. The industries that have been the most disrupted happen to be the ones that tended to employ more women in the past, whether that is consumer and retail or the nonprofit sector or the travel and tourism and recreation sector. These happen to be large employers of women, and these sectors simply haven't bounced back in the way that they were supposed to. And then the third element is technology. Now, we've seen a rapid acceleration of business model shifts over this last year and a half. And on the one hand, there is the possibility that more people with care responsibility can go into remote work. But on the other hand, the types of industry disruptions we're looking at and the types of roles that will form the jobs of tomorrow happen to be the ones that have much smaller pipelines of women going in, most notably, IT, cloud computing, STEM-related fields. These are the jobs that are bouncing back, and they happen not to have as many women going into them.
Latifa, Time's Up has been working specifically with companies to make the recovery more inclusive. You want to tell us a little bit about what they're trying to do and how other companies could learn from them?
Sure, absolutely. So we realize that in this moment where real systemic change is going to be critical in changing the paradigm and changing the shifts that we've seen playing out for decades. And we're faced with a moment right now to figure out how to do that. And certainly there are policy prescriptions that are going to help move that forward that can happen in Washington. But the other piece of it that is really critical and how we try to also accompany that change and those advocacy efforts is working with the private sector. We know that there are folks who are employers who are getting it right. There are employers who want to get it right. There are folks who, really see the value in investment in their workforce. They want to have an equitable workforce. And, there's about 300 plus members of our council who have said equity matters. We care about the care economy. Caregiving infrastructure is critical to the U.S. economy, and we want to do our part to figure out how to make that happen as well. So as a combination of, helping these broader conversations as we try to move policy, but also what can the private sector be in terms of, innovation. And so we're trying to also use models that we know are working to show lawmakers, to show employers and employees, look, there's another way to do this. And the more folks that we can bring in who are saying this is good for my business, but it's also good for my workers. And it's also the only way that we're going to be able to have an equitable labor force and find people to come into our jobs that we want to come in. And so that's a broad view of what this group has been brought together to do. But that critical piece right now is how the economy is going to move forward if we don't have the voices of those folks who are driving at the employer level of, tens of thousands of folks who are represented in our council, tens of thousands of employers, that is, then we're not going to be able to, all of us as a country and as a society, really move forward.
Obviously, there's a role for government in this as well. Aijen, you've talked about this whole question of a care infrastructure that the government can help provide. And obviously, the Biden plan has some of that in it. Can you walk us through what kinds of things would really help?
Absolutely. I think we are in a moment where we are redefining what infrastructure means. And if infrastructure is that which enables society to function and the economy to function, then caregiving has to be considered as part of infrastructure, and it has to be invested in. And what I mean by that is the child care, the paid family and medical leave, the elder care and support for people with disabilities, those programs and the workforces, the early childhood educators, the home care workers and home health aides, those workforces are all essential infrastructure to support and enable working age adults to actually return to the workforce, especially women. And so we need to be investing in these programs that support access to childcare and make it much more accessible and affordable for more families. We need to be investing in home and community-based services for the growing aging population. And we need to be raising wages and improving the quality of jobs for the workers who work within the care economy so that we can secure this part of the essential infrastructure that will enable everybody else to get back to work. And that is what is in the Biden Buildback Better agenda. There are significant and robust proposed investments in childcare, paid leave, and home and community-based care for the aging population. And it would be transformative in terms of supporting women to return to work and to support the workforce that works in the care economy and all of the people who rely on those services for basic dignity and opportunity.
Sadia, so far we've been very U.S. focused. I know your book is very focused on the Muslim world and the women who are joining the workforce there. Are there lessons either from their experience or the things that they need that are similar to what Americans are asking for?
A couple of points there. Interestingly enough, it's been very much the same as the rest of the world in terms of the rollback on women's participation, because yet again, whether that care infrastructure is government provided or whether it's privately provided, or in a lot of the Muslim world, really provided through the families, through the grandparents that provide the care support for childcare, etc. All of that has essentially led to the same outcomes, which is less women are going into the workforce. There's been a rollback of that progress. So it's a very similar situation to the rest of the world. But maybe just stepping back on this, let's look at who the leaders are. It's the Nordic economies. It's because they do have that care infrastructure, and they're likely to be the ones that maintain most of their competitiveness in terms of the economic recovery and in terms of bouncing back from this crisis, because they actually have the support in place to get all the talent back into the workforce. And I think that's where, from an economic policymaking perspective as well, this makes a lot of sense to ensure that there is that investment in the care infrastructure and the broader social infrastructure, which includes, of course, teaching and schools and a number of other factors as well. So that's going to be, I think, one critical piece for most economies to really think about very differently. This is one of the key investments for a strong economic recovery.
While we're on the subject, actually, we're talking about we need investment, we need programs. Are there concrete examples of where things make a difference, where you can see them making a difference, a specific change that makes a difference? One of you want to leap in with, if you could pick two things that would really make a difference, what would they be?
So I'll just give one example. As Aijen said, on the care spectrum, certainly there are lots of intersections: childcare, paid leave, home and community-based services. And we've been doing analysis this year to sort of, we have a lot of data, of course, over years that show this is the problem. And so what we've been trying to do is say, with the proposals today that folks are debating, right at this moment, what could this look like? So taking paid leave, for example, which is something that, again, if we're comparing us, internationally, this is a place where the U.S. does stand out in not having a national paid leave program. Our analysis shows that enacting a national paid leave program would generate $28.5 billion in national income and create 162,000 new jobs. Notably, some of the industries that we will see the most job creation would include food services, healthcare services, hospitals, retail, et cetera, which is where major employers of women and people of color across the country are talking about shortages, for instance.
I would add too, absolutely agree with Latifa on that. I would also add that the caregiving workforce globally has always been undervalued, and it has always been overwhelmingly women who do this work, and oftentimes migrant women, women of marginalized social status. And working in this profession is oftentimes so challenging to sustain because the wages that workers earn are essentially poverty wages without benefits, without access to a safety net. So if we were to invest in caregiving jobs becoming good jobs for the 21st century that earned a livable wage with benefits and real economic security, that would be transformative for those workers and their families, but also for all the families that they support.
Sadia, are there particular Nordic programs that you think would do well for the rest of the world?
We just very supportive of the comments that Latifa and Aijen have made. But maybe in addition, I think the other piece that matters is what is the framework that employers are setting for everybody else who is not employed in the care workforce, but for a lot of the other workers. Are we building the kinds of workplaces that allow for parents, for example, to balance their caregiving and family responsibilities with their work responsibilities? And this is where the movement around ESG, around environmental, social, and governance metrics, the movement around stakeholder capitalism, these are all things to leverage in the broader sort of large multinational company space, because they are the ones that set really a bar that then their value chains and others can also follow, that small and medium-sized businesses can also follow. So it's really important that big employers set a very different framework for their workforces, which then coupled with the public infrastructure investments can provide a much better path forward.
How do you, when you're valuing companies' claims on ESG, how do you decide what's real and what's not? I mean, I'm thinking of JP Morgan's famous for, Jamie Dimon's always saying very green ESG kinds of things. And yet their reaction to the pandemic is everyone must come back to work now. And somehow to me, that doesn't measure. How do we hold people accountable and make sure they really are creating the jobs you're talking about?
I think this is the movement around the S part of the ESG is sort of the next frontier to tackle. There's been so much work around climate, around net zero, and this is the moment where if we really dig deep into the S around ESG, that includes targets around gender diversity, but certainly much broader forms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It includes pieces around reskilling and upskilling. It includes parts around retaining workers and retraining them, and ensuring that your human capital is really able to flourish. So I think now is the moment where we start having not just a movement around it, but also a lot of transparency and metrics. This would be the moment to leverage. The second piece I just add is this is a moment of change. This is a moment of disruption. This is also the moment where we can hardwire gender equality into the future of work. If companies think about what will be the growing professions of tomorrow, this is the moment where they can start building that pipeline. For example, right now, cloud computing talent in the United States, only 14% of that cloud computing talent is women. And yet we know this is one of the fastest growing skill sets that's in demand. So this would be the moment to put in place the right kinds of investment, both from the sides of employers, but also public, private, and university collaborations that get us there.
Latifa, you do a fair amount of collaborating. Any good examples, things that other people should follow?
Yeah, I do want to put a finer point on the equity principle, which Sita just illustrated. That's really, to be honest, thinking of the ESG and thinking of how folks have that conversation in one room, in another room, they talk about diversity and inclusion, and how a lot of those conversations are not really integrated in this moment, though there are several companies in high profile startups, et cetera, in tech world and in healthcare and others who have at least shown that their public profile when it comes to equity and inclusion is important to them. And so how are they meeting this moment in saying, yes, we want to hire people of color. Yes, we want to hire and retain women. And part of the way that you do that is that you have not only an inclusive in terms of who you're hiring, but the inclusive community environment in the workplace and your policies. And so those things go together 100%. And knowing that people come into these companies, they leave. There's been a lot of high profile cases around discrimination and a whole host of really horrible stories that you're hearing where companies are super excited about their gender diversity, but then they're just sort of just lists and lists of scandals of people who are just not feeling like these are safe spaces. So if folks really want to say we have a workforce of the future, it's going to be people of color, it's going to be women, and how you retain and create a new workplace. And what we've been talking about is like, how do we change the workplace, not from the employee side, but from the employer side? Like, what is that culture principle that's really going to take us to the next generation? Because we know in some ways quite painfully that the current model is not working, and it will continue to have, I think, especially in this very more transparent world, more of an effect on the profile of these companies.
Jen, do you want to weigh in?
Well, I was just going to go back to Sadia's point about the future of work, and to say that it is actually the case that there's so much about the future of work that we don't know. We don't know how technology is going to, and how it's all going to shake out, and what the jobs of the future will necessarily be. But we do know that we will need in-person service work, and that the likelihood that much of that work will be done by women is quite high. And jobs like home health care, for example, in the United States, with a growing aging population in need of care, these are jobs that can't be outsourced and won't be automated, but they've always been poverty wage jobs. So one way to really think about equity in the future of work is about looking at the low wage service jobs, in-person service jobs like care jobs that have always been dominated by women, and figuring out how we make them good jobs for the 21st century, where you can support a family and one generation can do better than the next, because we know those jobs are here to stay.
Can I just add one thing, and just saying that, it can't be overstated just how much we move in this economy and in the workplace around a model that doesn't really fit or exist, or perhaps never fit for millions of workers, and workers of color in particular. But there's this, going back to a time when we had these structures, some of which seem arbitrary to a new generation, and how we work, how we show up. What that is going to mean moving forward, I think, will be transformative. And one thing we do know that we haven't addressed is that there are not one parent out in the world and one person staying home taking care of their parents and their children. And we haven't met that change that has so dramatically happened over the past, many decades. And that is still going to have a disparate impact on these folks who are not participating in the economy. They're not spending, they're not purchasing, they're not working, because we are still trying to fit working women, working families, that dynamic into a really, really rigid and very old structure that has expectations that a lot of folks just can't meet anymore.
That actually is something one of our audience questions is about, and I think it might be a good moment to bring it in. It's a woman who's in her 30s, and she says so many of her peers are choosing not to come back to work because during the pandemic they had babies or they had to drop out to help their kids with school, and now they just can't get back. What can be done to encourage these people back into the workforce when things are still somewhat uncertain? And what can we do, if we can't solve it right now, what can we do over the next 5 years?
We can invest in our care infrastructure to make caregiving services available and accessible and affordable for working women. And I think we can also raise the wages across low-wage sectors where women are disproportionately concentrated. In the United States, before there was a pandemic, there was an epidemic of low-wage work, where so many women were working incredibly hard and still not able to make ends meet and pay the bills, having to choose between gas and food, or the electric bill, or rent. And if we raise wages, we can actually attract workers to return to work, in addition to providing the care that they need.
Sadia, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, raising wages across a very large range of low-income sectors is one of the critical lessons that comes out of the pandemic. If we think about all of the essential frontline workers, again, very dominated by women, these tended to be low paid and precarious jobs. In some cases, perhaps not precarious, but certainly low paid, whether we're looking at the health sector or the care sector, or logistics and transport and delivery. So it's very, very clear that we do need to think about job quality and job standards and wages in these areas. And one of the ways to contribute to that is to invest very significantly in a different kind of certification and professionalization of these roles, and to make them very attractive roles for the future. And for many governments around the world, as they look to create more jobs as their economies recover, this is a very good investment to be making. It will create more jobs, and it creates a virtuous cycle across many societies.
Do you want to jump in, Latifa?
Yeah, just on the job creation piece, that's really critical. We have been in this moment, as in the United States, trying to push these caregiving policies forward with a very, very, very broad coalition of support, I will say, on both sides of the aisle and across multiple movements. That we've been talking about the GDP conversation. We did a little analysis recently, and basically we came up with, due to the 3 million, I believe, women currently constrained by caregiving responsibilities joining the labor force. It's not the only way these proposals would boost the economy, but the investments could create 2.1 million new jobs. And, we assume that the majority of those 2.1 million jobs will be filled by women. And so, this is a way the investment will play out in our analysis so that women are able to participate, more women are able to participate. And the women that Ajin's talking about who need quality jobs as well. We're never going to fix this problem unless we really go to the roots of some of where we are today. And the job quality, of course, is a very, very large part of that. And that goes into these proposals today. We're not talking about creating a care infrastructure that looks sort of like what's out there today, a care infrastructure where the jobs are better, they're valued, folks are paid, and in the case of childcare, for instance, parents can assume their kids are going to be safe. There's a roadmap for this that we've laid out, and we believe will work if the investments are made.
Do you want to be a little more specific about what kinds of things make a difference? I mean, I remember trying to hunt for a nanny for my children, and I at one point ran through 4 because they were all terrible.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. We know that some of which has been raised before is certainly readiness, training, supports, so that these jobs, which as they should be, can be careers. There's a lot of turnover, as you mentioned. There's not a lot of supports in the ways of training and benefits and living wages. So people are balancing multiple things. A lot of folks are working multiple jobs even. There's stories that folks are talking about their teachers. I read a story yesterday about a parent seeing their child's teacher serving tables when they were out for dinner. I mean, these are critical to taking care of us and our families, and we're just not valuing them. And I think that how we pay people, how we train people, what the supports look like. It's not fair for me to have paid leave and healthcare from my employer, but not a childcare worker. These environments should be safe. We know what it looks like to have quality childcare. We know what it looks like to have a safe center where the employees are cared for, but it is just so hard to find, and the need is not being met at all. So people are having to make really hard choices, taking their child someplace that's not safe, not working at all. And, it's just the investment so we can reproduce the good models that we know are out there that exist.
Sadia, you mentioned earlier the need to get women into some of the jobs of the future that at the moment are quite male dominated, particularly IT and things like that. We have an audience question asking, if you were bringing women and minorities often as well into jobs that have traditionally not been welcoming, what can be done? Are there particular programs or particular methods of making the work environment more welcoming? So once we get them trained, they don't walk in and then just hate it.
Yeah, I think this is where the work environment point just becomes incredibly critical. We know that you need a certain critical mass of the minority group to be present for that to become a more comfortable environment for everyone. And so most organizations will have to think about this very, very carefully because we're talking about very small percentages of women on some of these areas. What I think is a positive element, though, is that most businesses are starting to recognize this if they want to bring in the best talent. There are, at the very same time that we're talking about a jobs crisis, we're also talking about a talent crisis. There are many unfilled jobs, while at the same time, there are so many people that are facing unemployment. So there is an opportunity here where businesses have a very natural inclination or incentive to reach out to a broader pool of people and then to ensure that they're creating the right environment around it. One of the things we've been doing at the World Economic Forum is setting up public-private collaborations in countries around the world. At the moment, we're doing 11 pilots in Latin America, in Africa, and in the Middle East. And one of the first areas of business that most governments want to look at is how do you build the right care infrastructure? And then from the private sector side, really, how do you build the right environment so that all of this investment actually leads to having the right talent? So I think the government employer coordination and collaboration is critical if we want to get this right.
Yeah, we have a system in the United States that folks are familiar with, an apprenticeship system that, has had its, high points and low points in terms of both popularity and, alternatives to four-year colleges, which, a lot of folks are considering right now. But as you look at, to your point, a lot of those programs are not ones where women are welcome or where women are encouraged to go into. They're not to say that there are not folks who want to go, for example, into skilled trades, and not that they should. Manufacturing is a major growing industry in this country, as is transportation and technology, as was mentioned, all of which are suited in multiple ways for women, but the barriers to access are too hard. And once people are there, it becomes an alienating environment. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be also focusing on those occupations where women are. We've been beating our head against the wall for years saying, there should be more women in tech, there should be more women in engineering. The pipeline problem and the fact that people get there and find that it's not hospitable. There's no caregiving, there's discrimination, there's harassment, there's a whole host of things that are more cultural and climate in nature that's forced those women out. Is why can't we make those same investments in some sort of training program that's private and public, just like we've had with apprenticeships that span industries that are not just focused on those places where men are, like caregiving and others, so that women can not only see themselves on a trajectory, but they can even think of themselves as business owners and the ones themselves who are generating the growth in those sectors. And we just, again, that goes back to our thinking around workforce readiness, our thinking around where investments need to go for training are still in the dark ages.
I would just add that I think in the design of these programs and in these partnerships, especially in public-private government-employer collaborations, that it's really important that working women have a seat at the table and are able to inform the design of these collaborations. I think actually including the voices of the women who we want to be taking these jobs and sustaining in this work is going to be really essential in terms of being able to reshape culture to actually be supportive of women in the workplace.
That actually dovetails with another audience question, which is, how do we have honest conversations about these very difficult issues at a time when civil discourse really seems to be breaking down? Have you all had much success in getting people to sit down and talk to each other about, solving these problems?
Well, the discourse, I think there are highs and lows. I believe that there have been moments where, including the creation of our organization, where, a public discourse was driving change, and more of a public conversation and awareness in a moment was able to spark some real movement and folks coming together, because you realize you're not alone, or you realize there's a strong group of people who span different parts of our culture and our society who can come together. So for sure, there's a lot of shadows to that, and there's lots of negative discourse, and it's very difficult to mine through all of that, unfortunately. But I think that there is more opportunity than less to use the discourse as it is now for folks to find each other in these moments. And I do think that is actually an example of something that some companies are doing. It's the risks involved, but some companies who are trying to have these conversations internally are having more open forums for their staff. There are places that people can, have like-minded groups coming together in either an open forum or small groups. That is something we see a lot of individual caucus style conversations happening with more progressive companies who know that there needs to be community around the change that the innovation that they're trying to see move forward. And that discourse can be extremely positive, but, folks have to take a risk. That discourse can also be transformative in a way that perhaps isn't intended. So it's sometimes, I think, from the business perspective, can be risky, but it has to happen at multiple levels and within the cohorts or communities, whether it's your workplace or your school, where we have seen a lot of, I think, very high points of the discourse that's happening today.
Sadia, do you want to jump in?
I think some of the discourse is about the broad public discourse that we've just referred to, but there is also, I think, a need for ensuring that the conversation around, for example, closing the gender gap is happening among ministers of finance, is happening among some of the top CEOs around the world. And that's very much what we're trying to do here at the forum, because this has to be a conversation that involves everybody. And this has to be something that is central to economic policy making and to business strategy. And that's one more piece of that discourse that I think we need to ensure happens.
I would just add to that that it was a very significant breakthrough that the President of the United States made investing in the care economy a core pillar of his economic agenda. Not the women's agenda, not the family agenda, the economic agenda. And I think more recognition of the essential value that caregiving and the care economy provides to all economies and to the global economy is really, really important in our discourse. And just in terms of your question about models, in certain cities, like the city of Seattle, for example, our movement was successful in passing a domestic workers' bill of rights that established a standards board that brings employers, the city government, and workers together to talk about how to improve standards, working conditions, and also quality of service in the sector. And I think that kind of a tripartite conversation where there's a seat at the table for everyone, I think is really, really important in this time.
That's a nice positive example. I'd actually be interested in hearing from all three of you about, are there reasons to be hopeful? Are there specific, examples or developments or things that you think suggest we are making progress, even though the last couple of years have been tough?
Well, certainly there have been a lot of states and localities moving to just build on Ijen's point, take paid leave in particular, where 10 years ago, we didn't have as many states and localities and cities moving forward. DC, for example, that just recently expanded their paid leave and has one of the more liberal paid leave or progressive paid leave policies. We see it also with minimum wage and the national minimum wage, and states and localities essentially making the decision locally because it's working for their people. It's what they're hearing. They test it. I say this is hopeful because we see this movement happening, and it's not just happening in the New Yorks and Californias. It's happening all over in the upper Midwest and in the middle of the country, not as much, but we are seeing not only movement at the state level, but we're actually seeing how these policies like paid leave and raising minimum wage actually play out. So this idea that we would be going into the vast unknown if we make these investments is really false. We've seen multiple years in some places like Rhode Island, Connecticut, where there is paid leave, for example, that and sick days that are paid for folks too. And it is actually good for workers. It's good for the state. It's good for the economy. And so it's hopeful because the more the years pass, the more data we have to show that this is actually a benefit, in fact, and it is something that we can afford.
I think it's incredibly hopeful that we're even talking about care as infrastructure, and that Sadia and the World Economic Forum is talking about care infrastructure. That's a big shift in terms of valuing the work and the contributions of women from an economic standpoint. It's actually quite a significant shift.
Sadia?
I'll just add to this. As much as the rollback that we've seen in the last year and a half is obviously a massive negative, this moment of disruption does give us an opportunity for change. It gives us a time for bold and visionary leadership. And there is a very clear economic case that is now ready. And at the same time, there are, again, taking a global perspective, in advanced economies, fairly large fiscal stimulus programs that can support these agendas. So I think this is the moment where we've got this window of opportunity for some change. And I think I certainly remain very positive seeing some of these developments around the world.
Hear, hear.
That seems like a good way to sort of end up. I guess if perhaps as our very final question, again, if you could pick one thing, each of you, that you would really like to happen in the next, say, 12 months, that would really make the difference towards helping get women back to work and having a fairer world economy, what would it be?
I would want to pass the Build Back Better agenda, which includes really big investments in childcare, paid family and medical leave, and home and community-based care for the aging and people with disabilities, including raising wages for the caregiving workforce.
Sadia?
I think around the world, we need a Build Back Broader agenda. It needs to be one that includes many more people and creates opportunity for all, and again, ensures that some of the spending goes to the right places.
And Latifa?
Yeah, I agree absolutely with both of you in that if we pass this, we will be on that path to building if we are able to move Build Back Better in the United States. And we know that building an inclusive economy requires paradigm shifts and policy changes, and the policy change is huge. And as we move that forward, we know that we can have a huge, huge advantage in moving the paradigm as well. Historically, care has been thought of as an individual responsibility, and one of the main the main drivers of our work is trying to make sure that we can remove that responsibility that has mostly been placed on women to provide unpaid care in many cases, and demonstrate that the power of these investments can accelerate the economy and begin to reverse what we talked about, the systemic sexism, the barriers to economic mobility, and stuck in this old paradigm. And I believe that if we make those policy changes in the next 12 months, we will be on that road.
I think that's a great way to finish up. What a really lovely panel. Thank you so much for your really thoughtful contributions. I think the audience enjoyed it too. Thanks for joining us.